You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Gail Boisclair, a fellow Paris Underground Radio host and a property manager here in Paris. She's here to discuss a word that reflects an innate French distrust of data over humans, and a bit of this culture's resistance to change. Garant. So I am doubly thrilled to be recording this episode of the podcast. Firstly, because this word is super nerdy, and by super nerdy, I mean it is a word that we see borrowed into English twice. So the word warranty and the word guarantee are both linked to this French word garantie, or the linked word Garant, which is the subject of this podcast. And just as a little linguistic nerd, ridiculous bit of trivia, a lot of words that are borrowed from both French and Norman French, you can see with that difference between a G and a W, which is why Guillaume and William are the same name. Fun fact. But the other reason I'm so thrilled to be recording this episode of the podcast is because we have a fellow podcaster from the Paris Underground Radio Network, Gail Boisclair, who is here to delve into this word with us. So welcome, Gail, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. Gail, for people who don't know you and your work and your awesome podcast, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do here in Paris?
Oh, thank you very much, Emily. What a great, warm welcome. And yes, I have a podcast on this network as well, too, called Paris, A State of Mind, that I co-host with Marie. And we talk about everything related to apartments, rentals, buying, so on and so forth, in Paris and France. Even though we are a little Paris-centric, we can't help it. We live here. But in the real world, not the podcast world, I do have a company. It's called Perfectly Paris, and I manage furnished rentals in Paris, not the rest of France. And I've been doing that since 2001. Awesome.
So you are perfectly positioned then to help us navigate the word garant, which is something that, I remember when I first moved to Paris 15 years ago and I was looking for an apartment. First of all, you get caught in that weird catch-22 of you don't have a bank account, so you can't get an apartment. You don't have an apartment, so you can't get a bank account, which is this whole thing. But also people asking me constantly when I was building out my dossier, so this big portfolio of documents, for a garant. So just in the simplest terms possible for people who've never heard of a garant, what is a garant when it comes to renting an apartment in France?
Well, it's funny because you're right. The word doesn't truly translate to an English word, not that I'm aware of, or maybe I've lost all my English. So I guess the best translation would be a responsible party, someone who could vouch for you as a renter. So, I mean, as a foreigner in France, sometimes it's hard finding a rental since the things that you said about the bank account and so on, the vicious circle. But we also don't have a sort of credit history here or even a full-time job, if a job at all. So it's logical that owners would hesitate to rent to someone falling in this category. And that's why a garant is so important. So it's somebody that will co-sign on the rental agreement as a guarantee that you'll be paying your rent.
Right. Okay. And I mean, you don't usually see property managers asking for something like this in New York, for example, or in London. But I know that in New York, for example, they're going to ask you for your credit score, which is something that is not really part of the model in France, right? So, I mean,
it's not even the same.
Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, you're originally from Canada, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Canadian A.
So Canadian A. So we have this, it's 3 different models, but I think, when you look at the US, for example, you see this clear reliance on credit in terms of your standing, whereas in France, we're going to ask for other things like a CDI, which we've talked about on the podcast before, which is like a long-term contract that's basically you're not fireable, or, you'd have to be committing egregious errors to be fireable. But this garant seems to be, to me, to kind of stand in for what an American property manager would ask for as being a credit score. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah. I guess that's probably the best way to put it. Although a credit score is very different from a garant, even though I'm not entirely sure how it works. But I think with a credit score in America, it's basically compiles your debt or your used credit, like maybe mortgages, lines of credit, credit cards, etc., and it compares it to your available credit. Plus, it factors in your credit history, payment history, and all of this, as well as that's from my understanding. Whereas a garant has nothing whatsoever to do. They don't take any of that into consideration.
And so that's where I find this really fascinating in terms of sort of the French culture and the French character, is like if we zoom out a little bit, and obviously if I'm overgeneralizing, please pull me back down to earth. But I'm always really intrigued by the ways in which sort of these norms reflect kind of the character of the French in general. And I'm wondering if the fact that the French want a person to co-sign with you rather than like a bank or, your employer or something like that. Do you think that the French, for example, just in their day-to-day, whether it's in renting or not, are more willing to trust a person vouching for your character than they are to trust a score or, a printout or something?
Yes. And I think that that's probably might not only be French, but it might be a little more European, that they're more willing to trust you if you have somebody vouching for you versus some piece of paper from some machine that spits out some number related to you. And I also think it's the way that the French view credit in general. They don't view credit the same way that North Americans would view credit. Like even if we talk about a French credit card, which they used to only call it carte bleue, but it's really like a Visa or a MasterCard, sometimes American Express, but usually the first two. The French who have credit cards, they don't use their credit cards like a North American would use a credit card. When I use my Visa, for example, I'm either debited it immediately or at the end of the month, depending upon the preferences I set with my bank. But it's not like there's a credit that carries over and then I pay interest on this amount that's hanging out on my credit card.
Right. And I feel like that's something that North Americans, for better or for worse, are quite comfortable with. Like, oh yeah, you have this like balance that you're carrying. And we're obviously also comfortable with it. And this might be more of a United Statesian thing, but carrying, student debt. People have tens of thousands of dollars in student debt. Most French people, I don't think are living in this perpetual state of credit and debt.
No, definitely not. It's different. You'll even see it when it comes to the French going on a holiday or something. I don't think a French person, not any French person that I know anyway, would say somehow borrow money, take credit, in other words, to go on a holiday just because they're supposed to go on a holiday. Whereas an American or a Canadian might say, yeah, but I really need a holiday. Oh, you know what? On that credit card, that new one that they just offered me, they said I could have up to $20,000 in credit. The heck with it. I'm putting my holiday on that card.
Okay. And it's so funny because I feel as though French salaries are lower. The French have less disposable income than most. Like I would say like a middle-class French person has less disposable income than a middle-class North American. And yet, we're constantly from the outside looking in, seeing the French as sort of giving into these whims of, eating out in restaurants and going on vacation. And they aren't doing it on credit. They're doing it with the money that they have.
Yeah, it's more, I guess, live in the moment, enjoy your life, la joie de vivre, voilà, versus buy now, pay later, live it up, 3 bottles of Dom Perignon, and I'll worry about it when I die.
Right. And that actually sort of paves the way into another question that I had for you related to sort of this guarantee, which is the sense of security that you get when you finally do have your apartment in Paris. Because while the actual getting of the apartment can feel like a real circus, tenants, once they do secure an apartment, are pretty well protected by French law. Can you share some of the ways in which that's true with our listeners?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's very, very true. And I mean, first of all, we should even mention that generally, even to get an apartment, it's normal. Let's say the apartment rental rents for €1,000 a month. It's normal that to even qualify for that apartment, you have to actually earn 3 times what the rent is to even usually be considered for most apartments, which is kind of ludicrous because how many people really do earn 3 times?
Right.
But I mean, in theory, so I mean, it's very, very strict. And once you do get that apartment, yes, once you're in there, if you're in a furnished rental, for example, it's a 1-year contract, standard. And it's very easy for you as the renter to cancel because in Paris, for example, considered a tent zone tendu, you only need to give 1 month's notice and you can leave. Whereas the owner can only make you leave under 3 particular circumstances. First of all, if they want to take back the apartment for their own use, they can ask you to leave and they have to give you 3 months notice. If they're selling the apartment, same thing. They have to give you 3 months notice. And the only other way that they can get you out of the apartment is if you've really violated the terms and conditions of your contract. So it could be that, I don't know, you're a disruptive neighbor, you disrupted the whole building with your wild parties and so on. But then all of this has to be documented, registered letters. It takes a while. It's not at all automatic. And I shouldn't say this, but even if you don't pay your rent, legally, a huissier will not intervene if it's been less than 2 months that you've not paid your rent. So it has to be 2 months or more before you can even get legally somebody to intervene.
Okay, wow, yeah. And I mean, and you hear these what feel like urban legends, but I think are actually true stories of, if you, for example, even if you do commit these egregious errors, if it's the winter, for example, they're not allowed to kick you out until the spring, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. So it's usually about mid-October till mid-April, if I got it correctly. And yeah, too bad, so sad. If you don't pay your rent, it's cold outside, so you can stay there and squat the apartment.
That's so crazy.
It's ridiculous.
That must be tough for you to deal with as somebody who manages apartments, but
yeah, fortunately, I rarely have horror stories of squatters and so on and so forth, thankfully.
That's good news.
But again, it's all about the person that you're renting to, because I do try to choose my renters as well, too, not only for me, but for my owners.
Right. And that might also sort of give us the same reflection back on why having this in-depth dossier of documents, including the Garant, is so important in France, because once you're in, it's hard to get you out.
You are in. Yeah. I'm imagining that even if there were, just imagine a fire in a building and the apartment is burnt, then I think that you'd probably still have to end up putting your renter someplace else until the apartment is livable again.
Wow.
It's crazy.
It is. So I know that you deal with rental apartments, obviously, but being in this industry, I'm wondering if you have any insight as to whether the French in general are more likely to rent or to buy an apartment, and sort of how you sense that being different from the North American kind of approach to renting or owning property.
I guess part of it might depend on where you actually live in France, but I would definitely say that more than half of the French own their own place, probably even closer to maybe 65%. But it's viewed in a different way than, I guess, one would view it in North America. I think it's often over the long term cheaper to buy a place here than to rent due to mortgage rates versus the cost of renting a place. Whereas I guess in America, it's a whole big, long history of owning land. It goes back probably way before the Wild West days. I don't know. There was this song, like, not that I want to sing for you, but it's like, oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above, I mean, don't fence me in. That whole idea of having land seems to be important. And I guess there's something about the history of America that continues to build on this dream of owning your own place. But it's building on a dream more than sometimes, I guess, a reality. It's the ideal leave it to beaver world where there's the white picket fence and your happy home. And I don't think this has ever gotten out of the DNA of Americans. I think that truly the French have a much more pragmatic and less romanticized view on owning property or land. It's all about finances, practicality.
That makes a lot of sense.
That's my opinion anyway, but...
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
I also wanted to talk to you a bit about these new services that, new. I'm not sure how new they are, but they feel new to me. They definitely weren't around when I first started renting my apartments, but you can pay basically to get a service that stands in for an actual human garant. And some property managers allow these and some don't. But it basically means that if you don't have somebody in your entourage, in your, somebody, a friend or a neighbor or somebody who can co-sign with you, that you can get a service to co-sign with you instead. Is that basically how these work?
Yeah. So I guess to put a little history into how building a dossier works in France, an agency or an owner is only legally allowed to accept earning documentation from France. They can't accept any monies from or any currency from outside of the country. It cannot be taken into consideration to build your tenant file. So these companies and services that stand in for a garant, they have the advantage that they can accept finances from anywhere in the world. So if you've got, Aunt Matilda who recently passed away and left you a hefty sum of money that's sitting in your bank account, not in France, they can take that into consideration. So you may very well have enough to pay a year or more of rent in a bank account in another country that these companies can take into consideration, but a French agency or a French landlord cannot take this into consideration. It's not legal.
Okay.
So, that's how you can easily get then a garant through a company. They'll give you a guarantee. They'll take your international resources into consideration to figure out if you can indeed afford this a property that you want to rent. They will then, for a fee, they'll say, okay, based upon your worldwide income, revenue, resources, we will guarantee that you can pay a rent of up to, say, €1,500 a month. And you get a certificate from them, and the certificate is then submitted to the rental agency or the landlord as a guarantee. Of course, you pay a percentage to this company for that guarantee, but it is a good way for non-French people or people with resources outside of France to be able to have some sort of paper guarantee that they can pay their rent.
And so I'm curious, when it comes to sort of places, you see advertisements for apartments where people say, we won't accept this sort of garant. Do you think that speaks to a distrust or this adherence to tradition? Why do you think that landlords are unwilling to accept this as an alternative to the traditional human garant?
Well, the French don't like change. We can start with that. They don't like change. They are very set in their ways. We're all a little bit set in our ways, but the French are really set in their ways. And far be it to have some new fancy system that replaces a human being. I do think that there are a lot of people that won't accept it simply for that. As you say, it's not a person, it's a thing. You know, they're not ready to move into that era of digitization. They still want that human contact. And I guess because you never know where that money's coming from. You don't know anything behind where that guarantee is coming from these companies. Whereas at least with a co-signer, a human being actually signing on the contract as the co-signer, you know everything about them. You've got all their tax details. You've got their income statements. You've got their ID. You know everything about this person.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think the French, I mean, I don't mind. I've never actually had a situation where I personally have needed to take a guarantee from one of these services. I would definitely accept it. I have no problems accepting it. But I do know that you're right. There's a lot of agencies and owners that don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not French. I'm Canadian.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, Gail, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I have just one question for you before I let you go. And that is, what is your favorite word in French?
There's so many of them, but pamplemousse?
That's a good one.
I like that.
It's just fun to say.
It is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And for any of our listeners who haven't yet tuned into Gail and Marie's podcast, if you are interested in knowing even more about real estate and the world of French real estate and Paris real estate in particular, please do head over and have a listen. We'll put a link to the show in the show notes.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.